Probably not the video anyone was expecting, but here we are. Dark and Darker. Fantasy Dungeons & Dragons extraction shooter? No, not shooter. Well, in its current state, yeah, pretty much, but we'll get into that later. You go into a dungeon, kill monsters and other players, steal their loot, and get out so you can hoard the good stuff in your stash and be too afraid to ever use it. Before we start, I just want to add a quick disclaimer. I am not good at this game. I'm not afraid to admit that. And this video took way too long to make, so by the time it comes out, there will have likely been a patch addressing some of the things I'm talking about, or made them worse. Also, I admire anyone who makes games, even if those games are a broken mess. So if I make fun of the developers, don't take it too seriously. It's just how I make videos. That being said, the game has problems. A lot of problems.
Why is this what? His attack's just going through my sword.
Originally, my goal with this video was to outline every issue and give my thoughts about how to fix them, but as I wrote out the script, it became apparent that most of the issues in Dark and Darker can really be traced back to a few major things. These problems are so core to the game that I think it's safe to say that Dark and Darker, in its current state, is fundamentally flawed. I want to take you back to a game that made me fall in love with melee-focused combat games, Dark Souls. Dark Souls and the genre it inspired is known to be very difficult. This is mainly due to the intricacies of its combat. In Dark Souls, you can block attacks with just about every shield and weapon in the game, although some are better at it than others. All you have to do to block is hold down a button while you approach enemies, and it drastically reduces the amount of damage you take from them. It's a very easy, low-skill way for new players to play the game before they understand the deeper mechanics or have the chance to memorize enemy attack patterns. Also, I want you to notice something about the starting classes. Every single class in the game starts with a shield, even the spellcaster classes. The developers put a little bit of thought into it and realized that new players need an easy way to defend themselves at the start of the game. In Dark Souls, you can also dodge attacks. It's a little bit harder to dodge attacks than to block because you have to get the timing right, although you don't have to be exact. It's also a little bit more rewarding to dodge because then you don't take chip damage that you would from blocking. And finally, once a player has played the game a lot and has memorized enemy attack patterns, they can try parrying. It's the most difficult option of the three because it requires very precise timing, but it's also the most rewarding because it allows players to follow up with a high damage counterattack. These basic 3 defensive options are available to everyone pretty much all the time. Even if you go out of your way to equip items that aren't capable of blocking or parrying, you still at least have a dodge button. Now, there actually is a 4th option, strafing. The idea is to attack an enemy once and then strafe around or move backward out of the attack range. You'll bait out an attack and you can then take advantage of the recovery time after the swing by once again moving into attack. You can do this, but pretty much no one plays like this because it's tedious, more difficult than using the dodge button, and doesn't offer the reward that parrying does. Fighting this way will often result in taking damage anyway because you don't quite have the movement speed to get far enough away from every attack, or just the occasional weirdness with janky hitboxes. Furthermore, fighting bosses and tougher enemies with this strafing method is basically impossible. Now, out of these 4 defensive options, guess which one most resembles Dark and Darker's primary way of engaging with melee combat? The main problem with Dark and Darker is that the combat is bad. It's poorly thought out, if any thought went into it at all. Now you could say that I can't compare Dark Souls to Dark and Darker because one is third person and mostly single player, while the other is first person, mostly multiplayer. That's fair enough, I guess, but the point I'm trying to make is that there aren't many mechanics in Dark and Darker to actually engage with in melee combat. Yes, some classes can use a shield, but if you want to play anything other than those specific classes with those specific setups, you're pretty much stuck trying to strafe. But maybe you like the combat in Dark and Darker. People like Skyrim for some reason, so I'm not surprised. But whatever, I accept that some people like Dark and Darker's combat. Well, what you probably don't realize is that most of the major issues with the game that you definitely don't like arise out of its flawed combat. So, let's go over a few. Problem 1. Not enough players. Why don't people stick with the game? Well, I can tell you why new players quit the game. I've had first-hand experience with this trying to get my friends to play. They quit because they die 20 raids in a row without making it out of the first room. The only way to avoid damage is to sidestep attacks, and you can only really do that after spending several hours memorizing those attacks or watching YouTube videos on how to dodge them. New players don't want to do that, they just want to play the game. There's no faster way to drive players away than by making the moment-to-moment gameplay difficult to engage with and feel hopeless. Problem 2. PvE is easy and boring. In stark contrast to the PvE being basically impossible for new players, it's easy and unexciting for experienced players. This is because, since you can only strafe attacks, the AI and attack animations have very little variation to facilitate that. Enemies can't have interesting mechanics because players don't have the tools to deal with them. Once you memorize exactly how to strafe those simple attacks, PvE just isn't really a challenge anymore. Well, except for when you randomly get hit anyway due to the game being lazily cobbled together, or bullshit RNG mechanics, but that's a different issue entirely. Actually, what am I even talking about? No one actually engages in PvE if they can help it. They just exploit the shitty AI. The point is, PvE isn't fun or engaging for both new and experienced players, and it's because of the flaws in combat. Problem 3. Ranged is too powerful. Every PvP encounter is just 100 Francisca axes getting thrown in your direction, right? But why is it that even melee classes prefer to use ranged weapons? Well, because there are really only two options for most PvP engagements. Either both players press W and hold down the attack button and hope your gear is better than theirs, or you poke at the enemy with range attacks until you know their health is low enough so that you can win the ensuing melee spam exchange. If players could reliably dodge, block, or parry attacks, they would feel much more comfortable taking enemies head-on and relying on skill to carry them instead of whittling everyone down with ranged attacks. The fact that it's common to see two melee classes standing just outside of melee range of each other and throwing ranged weapons should tell you that there's some kind of issue with the melee combat driving both of them away from engaging with it. Problem 4. Barbarians are too strong. They just run up and kill you. Once again, there's very little counterplay to someone just spamming attacks on you. Now imagine that if when someone tried to do something as predictable as spam left click, you could just parry them and punish their predictable play. If only the devs would put weapons into the game that could do that. If only the ability to do that was already part of the game and could just be added to other weapons so that people have more options. Problem 5. Good gear is too good. You know what I've always found fun about Dark Souls PvP? As laggy and terrible as multiplayer often was, PvP could really be interesting because a low-level naked player could potentially beat a max-level meta-geared player. They could do this because a skilled player could take advantage of the various melee mechanics and outplay others regardless of gear. Now, can something like this happen in Dark and Darker? Well, kind of, if you are a longsword fighter, or if you have a way higher movement speed than the other person, but for the most part, no, because the options for counterplay are so limited, most fights just become a gear check, or ranged spam, like I said. There are many other issues with the game, but pretty much all of them come back to either combat or one other issue, which I'll get into later. I have to be fair here and go over the fact that some classes can use a shield to block, and there is that one weapon in the game that's also capable of parrying. However, even these limited options feel horrible and inconsistent to use. Why? Well, to explain why, let's once again go back to Dark Souls, or really most other melee games. In those games, blocking only requires you to hold down a button and face the enemy. That's it. When you do block, there's basically an invisible force field erected around the front arc of the character, and any attack that hits you from the front is going to count as blocked. In Dark and Darker, the actual graphical display of the weapon attacking you has to make contact with the graphical display of your shield. This is actually okay in concept, because in a first-person game you can freely turn to face the actual direction the weapon is coming from. But there are a few problems. The biggest problem is that due to lag or latency or desync or netcode or whatever you want to call it, this kind of blocking just doesn't really work consistently in multiplayer games. The developers should know this. It's been a problem since the earliest days of online games. In order to make these kinds of games work, usually, developers add certain things to compensate for lag and desync and all that. Hence why in most games blocking means you just have an invisible force field in front of you. Or, in For Honor, you pick one of 3 directions to block in, and any attack coming in from that direction is blocked, until you make a conscious effort to change the direction. There are probably lots of other ways to do it, with 20-something years of online games to draw inspiration from, but from what I can tell, Dark and Darker uses none of them. The other problem is that even if the online aspect caused 0 issues, in a first-person game, your character is a cyclops with one giant eye and no depth perception. It's very hard to actually tell how far away an attack from landing is, and where you need to aim to block it, or even if it's going to hit you at all. In fact, to demonstrate these issues, let's play a game. It's called Did It Block? Sparky has set himself up at the perfect angle to block the enemy's attack. Will the attack A hit him, or B be blocked? The answer was of course A. The enemy's attack ignored his sword entirely and somehow hit his arm behind it. Duh, get good. In this clip, I improperly positioned my sword and the enemy's attack is a moment away from tickling my balls. Will it A, hit me, or B, be blocked? The answer is C. It misses me entirely. Moments later, I attempt to block the same attack. I am both further away and more off to the side. Furthermore, my blocking sword is inside the enemy's attack. Will I get hit or block? Well, obviously that's a hit. Final question. In this clip, a skeleton is swinging at me from the side. I hold out my weapon to block at what looks like to be an angle that will intercept the swing. Will it A, hit me, or B, be blocked? That's right, it's both! Because the hitboxes are just the weapon's graphics, the shape of some weapons means that they can both hit you and be blocked at the same time. How intuitive and fun and consistent. Well, how did you do? Post your score in the comments. Also, take note that all these examples were just PvE. PvP is much worse. I'm actually going to posit the theory that the developers don't fix the combat because they don't really play their own game or understand how it works. Sounds a bit outrageous. Obviously, they made the game. How could they not understand how their own game works? Well, hear me out. We know that pretty much every asset has been purchased from the Unreal shop. I think that this sort of thing is fine, especially for indie developers. But you know what you can also buy on the Unreal store? Animations. And they are really, really cheap. Some models even come with animations. Do you think that the company who buys all of their assets paid someone to make fairly generic-looking animations? Or do you think they just used the default animations that came with the models? Or bought some animations from the same store and then stuck them in the game with no thought for how players were meant to interact with them? Players came together as a community and figured out a way to make it work with the limited tools they had, despite the developers' carelessness. In order to avoid some of these attacks, the player has to do things like crouch, look straight at the ceiling, and strafe counterclockwise around the monster while hugging into its hitbox. In order to parry the axe skeleton's overhead attack, you have to turn 180 degrees so your back is to the enemy, and then look straight up so their axe hits your sword at just the right angle. Are you seriously going to tell me that these kinds of maneuvers were intended and planned by the developers? If they were, that might even be a bigger problem, because that means developers think it's fun and immersive to be doing stupid shit like this. Do you guys remember in D&D where in order to not get hit, you have to turn your back to the enemy, walk 3 steps, and then turn back around? Yeah, that's how that works. Ah yes, the Ox God, favored of the Royal Knights. The risky yet deadly Helm Splitter attack. The legendary Fetal Guard position. And of course, the famed evasive maneuver, the Final Spinal. Combat in this game basically has no thought put into it. Part of me expects that the entire combat is just placeholder for what the real combat will be in a major future update. Except that as far as I know, the developers have never talked about that. No, they're too busy fucking around with adding new classes in arena mode. Then again, I wouldn't be surprised if nothing ever really changes, because I'm not completely convinced that everything in this game isn't just pre-made assets dropped into an Unreal project. Now, there is another major problem with the game, and it's actually also related to combat, but it's a big enough issue that I think it stands on its own. Because even if combat in the game was good and thought out, this would still be an issue. And that issue is movement speed. If you've played competitive games for any amount of time, then you know that movement speed and overall mobility are almost universally the most important things. The characters that have more mobility tend to perform better regardless of other factors. If you have more mobility, you can dodge enemy attacks, easily engage and disengage enemies, be the first to objectives, exploit enemies out of position, show up in unexpected places, kite and harass enemies, and literally run circles around the enemy team. Even in single-player games, the entire game is balanced around how fast the character can move and their overall mobility. The developers have to think carefully about these things. Can the player dodge certain attacks? Can they outrun certain enemies? Can they move fast enough to get through obstacles? Games are generally balanced around mobility. With most competitive games, the developers are very aware of this, so they normalize movement speed, which pretty much means that everybody moves at about the same speed. Now, sometimes there are classes that are more mobile than others, but the rest of the class is balanced around that. Even in games where you can use gear to change a character's movement speed, there are still strict hard caps and aggressive soft caps to try and keep variance at a minimum. In Dark and Darker, nearly every item in the game can raise or lower your movement speed. It's even part of one of the base stats. This means that very easily, players can be moving 15, 20, 30% faster than others at all times. There is almost nothing you can do against a player that is that much faster than you, except for use ranged attacks, which consequently is another reason why everybody uses ranged attacks, and why they are so oppressive. It also leads to a very stale meta where every build has to account for movement speed, so there's little room for variance. Not to mention, it's basically impossible to balance perks and abilities to account for their use with both low and high movement speeds. Unless movement speed is normalized or at least severely nerfed, basically every balance change to the game is pointless and the devs are just wasting time and money. The reason they don't make this change is because every weapon, piece of armor, enemy attack animation, and pretty much everything else would need to be reworked too, which pretty much guarantees they'll never do it, and that's a bad state to be in. As I said before, I understand that some people legitimately like dark and darker combat and would be upset if it had a major combat overhaul. Although I do find it funny that the defenders of Dark and Darker's combat system also talk about how fun and satisfying it is to use a longsword. The one weapon that, at times, feels like it's from a game with good combat. The cognitive dissonance is baffling, but that's Reddit, I guess. So what are some fixes that the developers could do to change combat to be better using things that are already in the game and don't really change the core experience too much? First of all, every class needs to be able to either use shields or weapons that can block or parry. And in the same notion, every default kit needs to contain one of them. New players need a way to defend themselves or they just won't play the game. It actually triggers me that you can't block or parry attacks with the Zweihander, considering what the weapon was used for historically. The fact that it has 2 sets of guards should give you a hint. By just making more weapons able to block or parry, you give the general population more options without actually taking away anything from anyone else. Nobody uses a lot of these weapons because there's no reason to, so give people a reason. Second, blocking and parrying with weapons and shields needs some kind of compensation to deal with latency and desync and lack of depth perception. The best way to do this without getting too arcadey is just extend the hurt boxes a little. Blocking would be way more satisfying and you really wouldn't even notice why. It would also be nice if when you get hit and block at the same time, it just counts as a block. Players being able to properly defend themselves leads to the potential of turtling and overusing shields. But this problem has already been solved in other games by adding a simple kick button. It doesn't do much damage as an attack, but it breaks through their guard to punish players trying to hide behind a shield all day. Kicking won't be the solution for everything though, because it can be punished with a normal melee attack if it fails to make contact with the shield. And there you go, a little rock, paper, scissors of melee interactions that will make fights way more engaging. We're not talking about Mordhau levels of complexity here, just a few options for engaging with melee combat other than holding down left click and pressing W. With these changes, yes, time to kill in PvP fights will go up because through skill you'll be able to read attacks and avoid damage. I just don't see why that's a bad thing. Of course, things will need to be balanced and tweaked, but just by making melee combat more engaging and consistent, you already solved several big issues with the game. I want to like Dark and Darker, I really do. I actually keep playing it even though I kind of hate it. The game is a unique experience and you know I love difficult games with unique ideas, often games that no one has ever heard of. Dark and Darker falls into that category, but it's so fundamentally flawed that it's hard to enjoy sometimes. For me, if combat is so broken that you basically can't improve at it, then the game feels kind of pointless to play. And if there's going to be a major combat overhaul, that needs to be the #1 priority. Because any content that comes out before it is going to have to be rebalanced and reworked around that new combat. The developers need to drop what they're doing with Arena and new classes and new maps and actually fix and nail down the core mechanics of the game. Although maybe adding an arena mode will wake the developers up to just how shallow and broken the combat actually is. Anyway, probably not the video anyone expected, but as I've said in the past, if I do make videos, it's just going to be about random things I'm passionate about at the moment, and stuff I feel like making. So, thanks for watching.